Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. I'm Tatiana Ferreira, Chief Customer Officer at Launchmetrics, and today's session will be digging into brand collaborations and how to break through the noise in the saturated collaboration market. I'm super excited to be joined today by the team at Highsnobiety. We have Edward Campbell, VP of Thought Leadership, and Tom Barker, Style Editor. A big welcome to you both. Why don't we take a minute for you both to introduce yourselves?
Wonderful. Hi, everyone. My name is Edward Campbell. I am based in New York. I've been with the company for about 5 years, and I oversee all of our strategy, insights, and thought leadership, globally across our business. Over to you, Tom.
Yeah, hi everyone. So I'm Tom Barker, based in our Berlin office. And yeah, I'm one of the style editors. So I write across .com and occasionally print, covering all things style related, which is as broad a topic as it sounds, but everything fashion related effectively.
Great. So before we get started within our discussion today, Highsnobiety are actually going to share a few slides that will set the stage before we get to chatting. So I'll hand it over to you guys.
Wonderful. Great. So Tatiana, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, wonderful. All good. Great. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Collaborations is a topic that we think a lot about at Highsnobiety. I think everyone can agree, as a consumer, it's certainly been a very dominant topic in marketing and fashion broadly over the last couple of years. We just wanted to sort of give a bit of context about who we are and how we sort of view the landscape. Highsnobiety really began as a blog almost 20 years ago. Really, always what we've been about is this place, what's next in culture, brands, ideas, products, thought leaders, influencers. We are really serving people who have a desire to figure out what's next in culture. We're currently speaking to about over 100 million unique users globally. They're very creatively minded individuals, and they really do come to us to figure out, as I said, what's coming up. We call our audience cultural pioneers. While a lot of other editorial platforms, I think, are really sort of doubling down on reach, what we're really doubling down on is influence. And a cultural pioneer, anecdotally, is someone who's highly curious, very knowledgeable, and they're really sort of seen within their social circle as the people to kind of hear about trends first and also pass those trends along. And in light of that, we're constantly researching this audience. And the journey that we've gone on with this audience is really kind of creating a whole cultural ecosystem, serving them for our brand partners. So we have, e-commerce, events, collaborations, the editorial offering that Tom is part of, and really sort of a brand studio and strategic consultancy as well. We're going to be talking a little bit about some insights that were drawn from our new luxury research today, as well as some fresh research that we've done in collaboration with Launchmetrics. The new luxury is our flagship research offering. We published our first report in 2018, and each year we've done a really important pulse check with this consumer about where the future of luxury is heading. So you can see in 2020, we did the Immunized Shopper, really trying to understand how the pandemic had influenced their relationship with luxury. A year later, new luxury, new normal. And then coming out of the pandemic, each year we do, a sort of landmark survey to figure out how they're thinking, about luxury. Our recent report, New Luxuries, New Rules, came out 2 months ago. And the final chapter is actually all dedicated to collaboration, which is obviously the topic we'll be speaking about today. I'll now just hand over to Tom just to talk about the editorial coverage that we've done on the topic of collaboration.
Yeah, thanks. So this image you're seeing is the lead image from an article that I wrote towards the end of last year in December. And what happened was, it's something that we do every year. A lot of other publications you'll see do this. And it was a best of 2023 list. And we ranked what we felt were the best collaborations of 2023. And obviously for this, it's very much qualitative. What the editorial team thought was stuck out the most. But then from the findings from this article, we then partnered with Launchmetrics to bring out a follow-up article, which is the one that you're seeing here. And the purpose of this was that we got all of the collaborations that we felt were the best of 2023. And we, with Launchmetrics for us, then discovered what each collaboration's media impact value was. And in this article, I kind of break down each of those collaborations and who made the top 10. So what you'll see next is our findings.
Absolutely. So before we get into the ranking, I just wanted to kind of share a couple of insights that came from that new luxury research. A sobering realization to tee up this conversation that we're excited to have is the fact that we really are in this era, as we like to call it at Highsnobiety, collaboration saturation. I think we've actually been in this era for a while now, but I think we can all agree that collabs aren't going away. The bar for what makes a really good collab is only getting higher. So 44% of pioneers found the majority of collaborations released in the last year boring. 67% want to see fewer but higher quality collaborations from brands. And this notion of fewer, bigger, better, if you will, I think is really something that's resonating across marketing broadly at the moment. And 71% agreed that the story you tell around collaborations is just as important as the final product. And for those that will read or have read our article or Tom's article, you'll see that the notion of storytelling is really an important theme. I'll just hand over to Tom now to kind of go through the ranking.
Yeah, so this is 10 of the articles which we picked out in our original article, and this is them ranked based on their media impact value. So as you can see, yeah, number 1, we have Louis Vuitton Yayoi-Kusama, a huge collaboration which a lot of effort was put into the marketing of, and we'll speak about that later. But then number 2, Balenciaga and Erwan, a collaboration that released just after a runway show which Balenciaga held in California, I believe. Following up was Loewe Howl's Moving Castle, a film with a cult following which really tapped into that market. And then the next 2 are 2 sneaker-oriented ones, Adidas and Wells Bonner, and Nike and Martine Rose.
Awesome. So that is teeing up our discussion. So I'll just stop sharing my screen now, and yeah, back over to you, Tatiana.
Perfect. Thanks so much. I'm always excited to have these industry discussions, but maybe just a tad bit extra excited about this panel as it's centered around this study. The study just went live this past Monday around these most impactful collaborations of 2023. And as you all just got a glimpse of, Highsnobiety used Launchmetrics data to measure those favorite collaborations. And it really was such a great project that we've been working on for a while with you and your teams. So it's fantastic to see it finally go live and of course, have the opportunity to discuss it and go through those findings today. Really taking, the data piece and mixing it in with that editorial or creative eye that you guys have brought. So my first question to you both, and to set the stage, is how do you perceive the role of storytelling in the current collaboration landscape? And why do you feel it's becoming increasingly crucial for brands?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can see from some of the statistics that Edward pulled out just then how, one of the interesting one is how a large proportion of people are bored by the collaborations released in the last year. And in a situation where we have what we've called collaboration saturation, the way to kind of stand out, we feel the way to kind of stand out is then storytelling. And that becomes increasingly important as more collaborations are released, right? So as the market becomes more saturated, as the bar becomes higher to be seen in this market, the way to stand out is no longer with products, because the market is flooded already with great collaborative product. The way to stand out is everything you do around that. And yeah, as I say, the pure novelty of 2 brands collaborating has become kind of obsolete almost. There have been so many collaborations happen.
Yeah, I mean, just to continue from that, like we've got quite a few sort of mantras, if you will, that we're constantly talking about within the walls of Highsnobiety. And one thing that I talk about a lot is this idea that people buy stories over products, or they buy stories before they buy products. And particularly with a youth-driven audience, a lot of the long tail of sort of seducing a future luxury consumer, it's a long journey. And the great thing about a story is it doesn't cost anything to consume, unlike a $3,000 handbag, for example, or a $500 pair of trainers as well. So I think this idea of leading with story, and also really giving the consumer a clear understanding of the rationale of the why. We also talk a lot about like, what's the why behind the match? I think people want that sort of joint feeling of feeling a little bit surprised when they see two brands come together. But then a moment after that element of surprise, it's like, that makes sense. I get it now, you know, and that's what storytelling is able to do, is to really kind of communicate that rationale.
Right. Like at first glance, some of these collaborations like Balenciaga and Erewhon, as a
Yes.
consumer, I take purely my just consumer hat. I'm like, wait, what? And
Yeah.
then things start clicking, right? So the why, I think really you've highlighted it clearly, like that is so important to make sure you're telling that why and telling it through the right storytelling. And in your role at Highsnobiety, you've been instrumental in exploring this intersection of youth culture and brand marketing. What are some of the themes you see in this new luxury research? And does the power of storytelling also play into it?
Yeah, great question. I mean, the way that I think about the new luxury work stream is, you know, it's a little bit like you know, the Marvel sort of, you know, movie series, and that you kind of, there's core themes with each film that every time we do a sequel, we need to kind of dimensionalize those core themes. So some of the core themes that really we saw going back 5 years ago in the original report was this notion of kind of knowledge being really important. And knowledge is tied directly to the importance of storytelling, because what we saw is that traditionally, if old luxury was about kind of materialism and exclusivity, and it was as much about who was not at the party as it was about who was, the new luxury was an environment that was a lot more democratic, but it was about what knowledge you had around brands, around culture in order to participate. And I think that I really like that, because I think sort of the barrier for entry has gotten lower, but the level of sophistication for what you need to know and how you need to kind of communicate currency has gotten higher. So luxury's gotten bigger, but the level of conversation has gotten more sophisticated over the last several years. And just this notion of kind of knowledge being almost a cultural passport to a conversation, again, that ties directly back to stories. You know, I think we're now living in a world where it's, you know, Balenciaga, you just mentioned earlier, you know, is a brilliant example of this, particularly where they were maybe a few years ago. But it's as much about saying to your friend, you know, did you see that thing that Balenciaga did last night? As it is like, oh, that's a cool product from Balenciaga. You know, I think these brands are almost thinking of themselves as entertainment businesses and almost publishers in their own right.
Yeah. And I think this idea of knowledge kind of being at the crux or almost working as a currency is, I often think about this personally, like, is it also linked to the fact that knowledge is everywhere, right? It's more available, consumable at any minute, at any given day on our phones. It's everywhere. So it makes sense that this shift has been happening naturally over time. And Tom, you've witnessed the evolution of collaborations within the fashion industry over the years. How do you see the landscape of collaborations changing, particularly in terms of the storytelling aspect? Again, tying it back to that, what role do media platforms like Highsnobiety play in really amplifying these narratives?
Yeah, I mean, Highsnobiety, especially from the beginning, has been very streetwear oriented. If we go back to the roots, and that's kind of a space where collaboration was a standard, and now we've gone from it being a niche to an industry wide thing that you'll see happen across high fashion to everywhere else. I mean, you'll see it done by brands like Zara now, which was not happening 5 years ago. So as we move forward and as it becomes even more of a standard, something that was written in our white paper was the collaborations are no longer product initiatives, they're desirability initiatives. And I think that's the big shift where as they become less and less about the product and more about creating desirability around a brand, we're going to see more of the niche, more brands align with niche communities, for example, where one of the examples in our study was Proletariat, Crocs and Levi's. I mean, that made it into the list without actually having a product to sell. That was a friends and family gifting opportunity where Crocs and Levi's went to a small artist who creates out of denim these very intricate pieces of work. And that was interesting from a pure storytelling perspective. I mean, there was no product to sell there. So it was really just a desirability initiative and a way for brands to align with creators and with communities that they find interesting.
It's almost like brands need to take a focus to be on more of this desirability aspect versus exclusivity, which maybe was the goal 10 years ago. And again, just a different way of thinking about it that I hadn't really considered before. Our study found that Louis Vuitton and Yayoi Kusama collaboration topped the charts, right? Over $39.7 million in media impact value. Can you provide insights as to why this was such an impactful collaboration and how brands can effectively craft compelling narratives around their collaboration?
Yeah, I mean, this was a particularly interesting one because we have something to compare it with. The two collaborated first in 2012 and then came out with this huge bumper collaboration last year. And what's interesting is the one in 2012 was already very iconic. I mean, the pieces now resell for a lot. Louis Vuitton fans will know it very well. But we saw that when they've decided to do a second round of this collaboration with product, Louis Vuitton really doubled down on its marketing efforts. And it was, I mean, something I said in the article was, if storytelling is the key, then Louis Vuitton told its story the loudest. And that's effectively what it did. There was so much going on that was all focused around the artist as well, not so much around the product, such as, I mean, there were these huge installations at every shop you can imagine. There were these incredible like 3D billboards in Japan. There was, I mean, I don't think anyone could have gone for the first 2 months of 2023 without seeing it somewhere. And yeah, it's very interesting to see the contrast in 2012 to create a collaboration that impact. The brands did a couple of pop-ups, but nothing too crazy. In 2023, to create what was our number one ranked collaboration, the brands really did create this huge spectacle, which by the end of it, one of the interviewees that I spoke to about it said the product became a souvenir almost. So the product is a souvenir that you get from all of this storytelling around the artist and all of this interest that you've now gained from the artist, from these huge installations that the brand's created.
Yeah,
Right.
I mean, just to riff on from there, I think if you think about how Louis Vuitton also look at, say, a fashion show, it's almost a media event in and of itself, right? So an interesting question is kind of how is each brand actually measuring success when it comes to a collaborative, project? So, the idea of Kusama and Louis Vuitton, that was actually a mass marketing exercise in many ways and an attention-grabbing exercise for the brand as a whole. Whereas some of our other collaborations are really actually designed to activate specific passion points in specific communities. I think you could look at the Kusama Vuitton collab as a really well executed, incredibly sort of invested in exercise, but it's really a marketing exercise for the brand as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, I could almost compare it to like how Chanel still does couture shows, even though couture is a losing business. It is purely just, yeah, like we said, a marketing exercise.
Well, and it's almost like the storytelling is also creating experiences for these consumers, right? Like, to your point, thinking of the product more as a souvenir. It's a souvenir of the storytelling, but also a souvenir of kind of going through that storytelling experience. And I know that the research also suggests that there's growing demand for fewer but higher quality collaboration. So I know we saw 67% of respondents expressing that preference. So how do you interpret this shift in consumer sentiment, and what implications does it have for brands trying to navigate the collaboration landscape? Edward, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think for the last few years, generally, the consumer, because we're not just looking at collabs, we're sort of researching all number of topics. The fashion and luxury consumer, particularly post-COVID, I think has been extra critically minded about what they're actually investing in. Sort of that question sort of makes me just think of just generally this idea of investing in things that are a little bit more timeless and meaningful and have more kind of tangible value is something that we're seeing. But if you relate that to collaborations, just this broader notion of fewer but better, I think is just applicable across much of kind of the fashion and luxury consumption mindset. I think it's related to the economic climate that we've been in over the last few years. I think it's related to the sustainability discussion that we've seen in the last few years. And when you think about collabs, they're a wonderful, I think, sort of litmus test of like, is this, an absurd, indulgent project that the world does not need? Or is this a meaningful, new, culturally driven moment that I'm interested in. You know, so many collabs fall flat in the same way that like a joke falls flat, you know, but also interestingly, the really good ones are super inspiring because you often end up getting taken to a space or to an environment or to a conversation that you maybe otherwise wouldn't have got to. So just that notion of kind of the customer wanting more out of the brand and the landscape that they're interested in, I think is highly relevant in collaborations and beyond.
Yep. And I can see someone in the chat actually put in, and I was about to say it, like consumers and people, we can now see through this, like anything that's inauthentic, right? So collabs for the sake of collabs, people see through that. They want more than that at the end of the day. It has to be meaningful. So, and I know that our study also cited the success of the Adidas, Wales Bonner, and then Martine Rose and Nike collaborations. They generated $5 million in media impact value. Tom, how do you see the value between these global powerhouses with these smaller emerging brands?
Yeah, I mean, it follows on really nicely because this is an example where it isn't a collaboration for collaboration's sake, or at least from the consumer standpoint, I don't think it ever felt like that. I mean, in both cases, these are huge global brands that are collaborating with smaller independent London-based labels. And in both cases, there was a clear reason for the collaboration. We speak about the need for the why. In both cases, it felt like there was one. I mean, with Wales Bonner, it's a continuing collaboration that I think has been going on for 4 years now. And with each one, there's some narrative about history or about the Caribbean's football relationship with football. Or at one point, there was a story about intellectual thinkers that was, and she created this kind of mythical university for these thinkers and what they'd wear. With each collection, the way Wales Bonner does with her own collections, with each collaboration, she brings something to the table in terms of the storytelling that feeds back into the product. And it's the same thing happened with Martine Rose. I mean, Martine Rose and Nike, I'm not sure if you saw, but they created the suits which the US women's team wore at the World Cup. So there's a really interesting conversation to be had there about the role of women's football, about how she said that she was looking at pictures of female footballers compared to male footballers and how the female ones often didn't have their own tailoring and suits, whereas on the other sides, they always would. So like we just said, consumers can see when something's just a marketing push, when a collaboration is done for the sake of it. And in both of these cases, where it very easily could have looked like a big brand was just pillaging from a small independent designer, that didn't happen. There was a clear conversation to be had. There was a clear story and red line running through both of them that really, I think, sat well with people on the other side of the screen.
Definitely. I mean, I think just one thing that I think about on those two examples, Martine Rose and Wales Bonner, is there's a huge number of people around the world that would not have heard of those brands if it was not for the Nike and Adidas collaborative moments. And I think that's the power, of, if you think about kind of the platform that a Nike or Adidas has in providing, access, reach, this kind of cultural cut through for these smaller emerging brands, I think it's a really nice payoff. The Wales Bonners and the Martine Roses are, adding huge amount of sort of credibility into Tom's point, these storytelling opportunities and the ability to resonate in niche, kind of community-driven environments. And then on the flip side, these powerhouse brands are just really kind of creating enormous reach that you really, quite frankly, need when you're a brand, only, 3, 5, or 7 years into your journey.
Yep, absolutely. I was actually someone not so familiar with Martine Rose, but I'm a big football/soccer fan. So that was the way for me to become familiar with that brand, right? And what a moment that was, like that collaboration. So, and Edward, perhaps you can shed light on that a bit more, given your experience working with brands like Nike and within the strategy and insights functions.
Yeah. I mean, I think, without sounding critical, I think we can all agree, and there's a lot written about this at the moment, that, Nike has had higher points in their history culturally than probably they are now. I think Martine Rose is a big win for them. But if you think about Nike, they've always been great at spotting emerging talent, right? whether that is spotting, you know, a young Michael Jordan, you know, and banking on that, but whether it's a brand or an athlete, this idea of fostering an authentic, honest, and mutually sort of valuable, you know, exchange with a partner can really sort of reap enormous benefits, you know, for a brand. And Nike, in many ways, have kind of written the playbook over the years, you know, whether it's the athletes that they choose to partner with, even just the Virgil Abloh, you know, 10 project, which is, I think, one of the most, you know, interesting footwear collaborative exercises, you know, of recent years. These things don't feel like flashes in the pan, so to speak. They feel like an ongoing conversation that the customer, you know, wants to be a part of and track.
And if we're looking ahead, how do you anticipate collaborations evolving in the future, especially considering this emphasis on storytelling, cultural relevance? Maybe what advice would you offer to brands that are seeking to cut through the noise and really create these impactful collaborations?
Yeah, I mean, without plugging my own white paper, please, anyone on this sort of call, it's free to download, and you know, I encourage everyone to have a look at it, particularly for this topic, the final chapter, new collaborations. What we actually do in that chapter, to Tom's point earlier, is we encourage people to, and this is what happens when we as an agency and strategic consultancy, the first time someone comes to us and says, we want to do a collaboration, our job is to say why. And are you able to achieve a similar outcome in another way? Because without sounding overly cynical, I think as marketeers, sometimes we have to start from the position of the world probably does not need this thing or need another thing like this, right? So if you stress test yourself so much, Tom mentioned the term, you know, desirability initiatives. That's how we now think about collaborations, is desirability initiatives. And if you ask yourself that, what other ways are there then to achieve desirability? And in our white paper, we actually offer 3 different ways of thinking about collaborations that don't actually even involve having an external partner in the traditional sense. So the first one is collaboration through archive. So this notion of actually almost doing a collab with yourself. If you think about fashion brands, particularly some of the more historic luxury ones, one of the most interesting points of fascination they have is their actual legacy and their archive. So can you bring something back? Can you bring back an era? Can you almost do a virtual, I'm just thinking out loud now, collaboration between the current creative director and a past creative director? That's one way of maybe thinking about collaboration. The second one is this idea of collaboration through moment. So if you think about the sort of the Rihanna at the Super Bowl in Loewe, or the Kendrick Lamar at Glastonbury in the Tiffany & Co. Crown of Thorns, that's really kind of creating a non-buyable product, but it's really creating like a heat moment, a brand heat moment for a brand driven by talent that's all taking place around a cultural moment. And so if you think about that, that's almost kind of using the mechanics of collaboration, but in a new way where it's not about actually having a capsule that is sort of buyable for the consumer. And then finally, collaboration through innovation is this notion of branching out of your usual lane and actually creating new types of products. Because we see that with this more pioneering consumer, they're interested in actually seeing their favorite brands try new things. So if you're a footwear company, you know, can you go into, you know, leather goods or ready to wear? If you're a ready to wear business, what would a line of furniture look like, et cetera, et cetera. And you can either, you know, bring on another partner or use your sort of in-house, you know, studio, so to speak, to kind of deliver kind of these new, so the spirit is almost collaboration, but it's not traditionally relying on that kind of same sort of external reliance of partner. So they're my 2 cents on the question. I don't know if you've got any other thoughts, Tom, on future of collabs.
No, you kind of smashed nail on the head there. The first thing I was going to say as well was what you said, which is to think about the why. I mean, that is kind of the most important thing, and it's something that came up again and again as I was doing the research for this article, and I was speaking to people in the industry about their thoughts. And again, people were saying, yeah, it's about the why. It's about the storytelling coming first, and if there's a strong base there of storytelling, then product can come second, and then the product will be strong. And when it looks like it's done the other way around, it's easy to see through.
And I love, Edward, this idea of tapping back into legacy and or moments. And as soon as you said that, I immediately thought of Versace with Jennifer Lopez, right? That iconic Versace, the green dress she wore at the Grammys. And then they did it again, right?
Yes.
So they had this red carpet moment and then created yet another iconic moment when she wore it again 20 years later. I think it was their spring 2020 show, if I'm not wrong.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm talking about with that moment pillar.
Yeah. And so we want to leave a bit of time to answer a few audience questions. But before we get to that, just want to ask you both what some final thoughts, insights would be that you want to share with our audience about just the general transformative power of collaborative branding. And then for all the brands who are tuning in, who are considering brand collaborations, what should they be keeping top of mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've landed on a lot of our sort of, 10 commandments, so to speak, without sounding too didactic throughout this conversation. I mean, I think just starting from that almost cynical notion of, does the world need this? Because there's all marketing and product output begins with a conversation between two people or a few people somewhere, right? And it's incredible how a conversation in a boardroom can several months later result in, either, an enormously successful project or quite frankly, an embarrassing cultural flop, right? So being super rigorous about what you're doing and why you're doing it and the best way to get the outcome along the way, I think is really important. And like I said, and Tom mentioned it earlier, this idea of, asking yourselves, is there other ways to deliver the desirability? And another thing actually that I've not touched on is I think often with collaboration from a sort of when people are planning them, if you're actually in-house in a brand planning collaborations, so often people, I think, get quite distracted by the names of potential partners, and the exercise becomes like so seduced by the idea of getting potentially the chance to work with X, Y, or Z. But really, I think really powerful collaboration sometimes, if you subbed out one partner and put in another, you might be able to tell the same story, unless it's a really, really, so like the Loewe, House Moving Castle one, that's a really, really specific one that's really about that specific partner. But in a lot of the other ones in the list, you could have actually maybe had a similar type of cultural moment and landed a similar story if you'd actually subbed out one partner with another. Or to say, don't get overly hung up sometimes on who the partner is. And I think if a collaboration sometimes lives and dies by whether the partner says yes or no, then maybe it's a collaboration that doesn't have an enormous strategy behind it. Tom, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. That is what we've kind of come to as a conclusion in the end of everything that we've done, right? So what you've just said there about if one person drops out, is it still needed? That is exactly what I was thinking. The other thing is, yeah, moving forward, I think for brands when they're looking at collaborations, it's going to get a lot more difficult to have something that hits in a time of saturation. So a lot of the things we've spoken about, as much as they're relevant now, I think moving forward, that's just going to be tenfold. And the why is just going to get more and more prevalent.
And that actually ties into one of the questions that I saw come through. So we have about 5-10 minutes left. So I'll take a couple of audience questions. And one of the first ones was around this idea of, being too saturated. So fashion brands collaborating with each other, is that already too saturated? And if so, what collabs do you think would cut through that? Because it feels like, and you guys have given some great examples, that there are more fashion brands that are collaborating with artists, right? Versus fashion brands with fashion brands. So yeah, one, I guess, is do you think it's already too saturated? And what collabs would be cutting through that noise?
Yeah, I mean, short answer, I think, hopefully we've alluded to this already. Absolutely, the landscape is too saturated. it's in the same way that there's probably a lot of saturation in other categories. Are there too many fast food restaurants? Yes. Are there too many crappy movies getting made every year? Yes. But every now and then, we see a movie that we absolutely love or discover a new restaurant, right? So I think that's just kind of the nature of, culture and consumerism and capitalism, quite frankly. And then in terms of what cuts through, something that has a mutual feeling of, unexpectedness, but value. People like to feel surprised, and people like to learn about what their favorite brands are into, right? So if you think about a brand as a person, when you go around to one of your friend's house and you see their, well, we don't really have DVD collections, anymore, but you know what I mean? When you see the things that they're into, the same goes for following Loewe and seeing that it's quite clear that Jonathan Anderson is probably a fan of Studio Ghibli, right? Who made Howl's Moving Castle. And so I think some of these more nuanced, passion-driven collabs I like, because I get a glimpse of the personality of the brand, and sometimes quite literally the personality of the designer.
Yeah, you're 100% right. I don't think we're at a point where it's too much of a saturated market for two brands to work with each other. I think there's examples like a Nike Cortez release. Nike Cortez released their sneaker last year, which is an example of two brands collaborating together on a shoe that completely changed almost the sneaker landscape. I mean, that sneaker was everywhere for so long. And it's because, once again, it was such a rare moment. Cortez has never done a collaboration before. It's got this cult following in London. Nike was able to tap that. Nike's got a massive role in the subcultures in London. So I don't think it's a situation where it's too convoluted. I think also the collaborations with artists, there's a lot of those happening. I think it's more about picking the right person than kind of saying, oh, you can't collaborate with a brand because there's too many brand collaborations happening, or you can't collaborate with an artist because there's too many artist collaborations happening. It's just about picking the right moments and the right person, and once again looking at that why.
And creating something unexpected. I feel like that's something that I've also been hearing from you both throughout our conversation. And I love that idea. Again, there's no DVD collections, but kind of seeing and understanding the brand, the designer, the creative inspiration and passion behind what drives these brands and designers. I actually had a conversation with one of the co-founders of Christopher John Rogers. I think that was last week or the week before. And they've also done some amazing collaborations. They worked with Orier. They did a wallpaper collaboration. And again, maybe at first glance, it's not so obvious, but when you see the wallpaper, there is something very authentically Christopher John Rogers about it. So I think the unexpected sparks that curiosity, I think is what, to your point, really makes these collaborations stand out to people.
Yeah.
And if you're thinking about maybe non-negotiables, this was, again, a linked kind of question, non-negotiables that brands should be considering when they're choosing the right partner to collaborate with. What would you say to a brand?
I mean, I think the non-negotiable from a sort of just more of a kind of internal planning and execution perspective is if you don't have the ability to tell the story, even on a base level, there's no point in doing it at all. It's phenomenal how many collaborations happen without us even hearing about it, which is unfortunately just a bit of a shame. It's a shame for the people that worked on that. It's a shame from a sustainability perspective to create product and output that doesn't get, valued. So, leading with that kind of story of like instead of kind of what person do we want to, or what partner do we want to collaborate with, what's the story? That's why there's so much power in saying, what story do we want to tell? Who's going to help us tell that story? Having that sort of mindset ensures that you will be leading with story. And you want, I think, Tom just mentioned the Nike and Cortez, that's a great example of something that becomes so powerful that there's almost a sense of ownership from the community and the consumer, and if you ignite that story, a collaboration becomes something that has cultural, momentum. So, that's a bit of a non-negotiable. And then another one is, I think, we might, I don't know if we've touched on this already, but in order to tell a really good story. Sometimes great stories can't be told by committees, you know, so often with the collaborations that we've been discussing, you'll probably notice that one out of the two partners took the lead in creative control. And often that will create a really sort of like powerful cultural cut through moment, you know. So, you know, Gap and Palace just came out a few days ago. You know, I guarantee you that Palace made that film that it launched with.
Yeah, definitely. And I think for me, so it's something that kind of feeds into everything we've spoken about. But for me, the one big non-negotiable is authenticity. And when we speak about things being surprising, sometimes it's easy to lose that authenticity. Let's just collaborate with the wildest idea that we have, and people will be surprised by it. And as we said, people will look through that actually ultimately as a collaboration for the sake of collaboration. Like Edward said, a product that the world and the planet probably doesn't need. I think finding that balance between something that's authentic to a brand and that feels like an authentic story and something that's still exciting, like the wallpaper that you just mentioned, is a difficult one to get. But that balance, I think, is where the best things can be created, and also a non-negotiable.
I feel like these questions are actually all linking together, which I love, because the next question that came in was about striking a balance. So an audience member was asking about making sure that there's a balance of equal input from both sides in the collaboration. So I know, Edward, you were saying you want to make sure that there's one that's a driving force, right, to tell that story. But how do you make sure it's balanced enough where the brand identity on both sides are still present and heard? So maybe knowing when to relinquish control, you know, and allow the partner to really drive the project.
Yeah. I mean, I think every collaborative project is different, you know, in its own right. But I think a lot of the collaborations that we've been talking about today, you know, it's where there are two brands from different corners of the landscape coming together. And by virtue of that, often you're, you know, in a scenario where there might be the bigger brand, if you will, or the more commercial brand, if you will, and then maybe the more culturally specific brand. And I think just in terms of ensuring, you know, there's balance, you know, just because maybe one partner led the creative campaign doesn't mean that there's not an enormous equal balance in everything to get there, you know. You know, I have no idea sort of how the, you know, Gap and Palace collaboration came about, but, you know, I'm sure that there was a lot of, you know, equality involved in actually kind of creating, you know, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? Who's it for? What are the final products? But really, I think when it comes to bringing it to life, again, having 10 creative directors sort of trying to make, you know, a film is not as powerful often as having one. So that was sort of my point there. But to get back to the question, Tatiana, I think being really clear at the outset of roles and responsibilities. And also when collaborations, you know, work, often if you've signed on the dotted line and you're moving forward with the collaboration, it is because you can see as a business, you can see that there will be an equal relationship, you know, moving forward. So I'd like to think, you know, sort of, you know, optimistically that if a collaboration discussion, you know, is moving forward, it's because both partners can see that they're able to have equal input.
Right, there has to be a level of trust there. And I think if brands are moving ahead with a collaboration, it's because they have agreed almost from the onset, right, that there's something authentic about the collaboration that they're about to build between their two brands that will allow them to work versus against each other at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of put a pin in that point, like every time you see a collaboration, it's funny to think, I wonder if that was their first option. You know, think to yourself, what other brands might have said no, you know, in that exercise, because more often than not, there's a short list, you know, that a brand will have of 5 to 10 potential partners. And the number one that they really want is not the one that they actually get.
Right. And there's also, when we think about how consumers have shifted, I think also consumers are more in tune with whether it's sustainability, giving back, just in general, both of those ideas and concepts. What are your thoughts on collaborations, either with like charities or nonprofits, or those kinds of areas and companies. Have you seen any company do that, or do you have any general thoughts around it?
Tom, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, I can't think of a specific example of where one's worked, but by nature, it's murky water, right? As
Yeah.
soon as there's a non-profit involved in something that is, at the end of the day, commerce driven, it's always going to be important that, I mean, we can call it storytelling, but important that the main goal is clear. So, I mean, if it's a collaboration that is looking to uplift a non-profit and provide money for them, I wouldn't see an issue with that. I think when that message gets lost or isn't there, that's when there can be an issue. But in general, I think, the collaborations are a great chance for, as we said, smaller brands to get seen, and also for nonprofits or for a charity to be seen and to raise funds.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you take the notion, if you sort of kind of go a little bit more macro for a moment and sort of take it past the notion of just charities or not-for-profits and more about how are you fueling communities, I think, you know, there's a lot of kind of fertile territory. So, for example, Highsnobiety was actually involved in helping to bring to life the Gucci North Face collaboration over the last few years. And one of the first campaigns that we worked on, we built this sort of creative platform that we called Eccentric Exploration. And it was all about championing unusual ways of getting into the outdoors beyond your traditional, you know, hiking and rafting, if you will. And we actually cast in our campaign real communities of young people that are getting out into the outdoors. So, for example, one of the crews, if you will, that we're in our campaign was a bird watching crew from London, like a Gen Z bird watching crew called Flock Together. Now, is that a charitable exercise? Not necessarily, but is it using the power of a collaboration to spotlight a community and an activity? Absolutely. And I think that's just as valuable in culture.
Right. It's almost like it's an extension of the collaboration, if you will, this idea of giving back.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if and you've just touched on another really, you know, another C word that it feels like marketing's full of all these C words, you know, culture, creativity, collaboration, community. But
P's, right? The P's are gone. Now it's the C's.
Yeah. But no, I mean, any sort of project that we're working on, there is a big question of like, what is the community exercise here? You know, and you know, maybe that's the topic for the next Highsnobiety Launchmetrics discussion, community, because it's certainly something that is really important in kind of this corner of marketing.
Great. I think we are just at time. So with that, I want to thank you both so much for all of your insights, for taking part in today's session and the summit overall. I'm sure the audience has quite a few things that they've taken away from our conversation today. So thank you both so much for joining, and thanks everybody for tuning in, and we will catch you at the next one.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for having us.